Most modern countries in the Western world have strict gun control or weapon control in place, with one of the only places that doesn't have strict gun control in place, the USA, being widely mocked for not having it. In countries with strict gun control laws, these laws appear to be working greatly, with no drawbacks, leading to many people in countries like the USA pushing for similar laws. Gun control advocates usually have very similar arguments. The first argument is to look at other countries with gun control to try and prove its efficacy. The three main countries pointed to are the UK, Australia, and Japan. The problem is there is no proof that gun control in these three countries has been effective at stopping gun crime or making anyone safer. In the UK, following a school shooting in 1996, private gun ownership was completely banned. Following this ban, gun homicides in the UK increased, spiking in 1999. It took over a decade for gun homicides to reach their pre-ban numbers. The overall murder rate in the UK, not just gun murders, also increased following the ban. In Australia, after a mass shooting at Port Arthur, also in 1996, the federal government passed the National Firearms Agreement, aimed at greatly restricting ownership of firearms. The Act created a National Firearms Registry, a 28-day waiting period to purchase guns, required a genuine reason be provided to own a firearm, and tightened the firearms licensing system. It also required that any guns owned by a private individual be stored securely. A gun buyback program for firearms was also established, which bought 653,000 firearms, costing $233 million. This act had a very different effect to gun crime than the one imposed in the UK. Following the buyback, gun crime decreased, which leads many to claim that this act worked. What these people fail to realise is that gun crime was already decreasing, and the act did not speed up this decrease. The act did manage to change other crime rates, though not for the better. Other crimes in Australia increased following the act, such as armed robbery. The third most commonly used country to push for gun control is Japan, which makes buying a firearm incredibly difficult, requiring many checks for things like mental stability. And while Japan does have a low gun crime, they generally have a low crime rate, at least for violent crimes, and their low gun crime is likely just a byproduct of this. There are many other countries that gun control advocates use for arguments in support of gun control, but what about the countries that they don't point to? Most importantly, the many tyrannical dictatorships that have existed through history and still exist. You would scarcely find a gun control advocate bring up the extremely strict gun control that existed in countries like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, and that's for good reason. Gun control in Germany began in 1920 after the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty that ended World War I went into effect, with Article 177 banning all civilian use of firearms in an attempt to pacify the German people. This law was rarely enforced until the assassination of Walter Rathenau. In 1938, the Nazis replaced the previous government's gun laws with the German Weapons Act. This act made it easier for most of the German people to purchase firearms, though it notably made it illegal for any company, even partially owned by Jews, to manufacture arms and ammunition, also making it illegal for Jews to deal in firearms and ammunition. The same year, another act was passed, specifically targeting Jews. This act made it illegal for Jews living in Germany to own weapons of any kind, from knives to firearms. Laws of this kind are always present in tyrannical countries because the government can do whatever it wants to an unarmed populace. Under Nazi Germany, approximately 6 million unarmed Jews were killed during the Holocaust. Under the Soviet Union, civilians would only own smoothbore hunting shotguns, and under Stalin alone, 6 to 8 million people were killed. Under many other tyrannical countries, such as the Khmer Rouge, many unarmed civilians were killed by the armed government. One of the most recent examples of this can be found in Venezuela. In 2012, the Venezuelan government banned the sales of all firearms, apart from sales to people such as police and military personnel. The government stated that the goal was to eventually remove all guns from civilian hands. Once more, this law did not decrease gun murders, which were already rising, but instead sped up the increase in gun murders. Soon after the banning of guns in Venezuela, the government began attacking protesters and arresting political dissidents, none of whom had a chance to protect themselves. The USA does have an abnormally high gun murder rate. In 2018, the CDC reported 38,390 deaths from guns. In that same year, the rate of firearm deaths per 100,000 people was 11.9. The USA also has the highest levels of civilian firearm ownership in the developed world, with there being 125.5 guns per 100 people, or 393 million registered civilian-owned firearms. Compare this to most other developed countries with lower gun deaths and lower gun ownership. It would seem that more guns equals more gun deaths. But once you look into the statistics a bit deeper, this idea begins to seem less and less true. The first issue is a pretty big one. Most gun control advocates will say there are 38,390 deaths from gun violence, which implies there are 38,000 gun homicides, but that's simply untrue. This number includes murders, suicides, and accidental killings. Most of those deaths are caused by suicide, and the true number of gun homicides in 2018 was 13,958, or 4.44 deaths per 100,000. Even after excluding suicides and accidents, the US still has far more gun deaths than other developed countries. The reason for this is not because the US has more guns in it, but instead, the US has more urbanized areas and more gangs in it. Gun crime is most common in poor urban areas, and often done by young males. African Americans in the United States are disproportionately likely to be killed by a gun. In 2010, African Americans were only 13% of the US population, but were 55% of the victims in gun crime. In 2017, African American males between the ages of 15 to 34 were the most frequent victims of gun murders, with 81 deaths per 100,000. 93% of blacks killed with guns were killed by other blacks. Compare this to gang demographics, where between 1996 and 2008, 32% of gang members were African Americans and 90% of gang members were males. School shootings in the USA are a widely talked about occurrence, and are often used to argue for better gun control. Everytown for Gun Safety reported that from the time of the Sandy Hook school shooting at the end of 2012 until 2018, there had been 290 school shootings. This number alone is absurdly high, and definitely indicative of a very serious issue into the US until you look into those 290 shootings. Nearly half of those 290 school shootings were suicides, accidental shootings, or shootings where no one was injured. The other half mostly had no fatalities. School shootings are in all reality incredibly rare, with there being only 11 confirmed school shootings spread out across 98,817 schools. Between 1993, on average 10 kids a year died from school shootings, which is 10 times less than from bike accidents, yet only 21 states plus DC require children to wear helmets while riding bikes, and there is no large-scale campaigning for laws requiring children to wear bike helmets. One of the biggest arguments in the US for gun ownership, other than gun ownership being a constitutional right, is gun ownership for protection. The entire point of the Second Amendment was for protection from government tyranny, and many guns are designed specifically to be carried around for protection. A CDC study was launched in 2013 to determine how often guns were used defensively. The study was conducted by the National Academies Institute of Medicine and National Research Council. The study found that defensive gun uses were more common than crimes committed using guns, stating, "Almost all national survey estimates indicate that defensive gun uses by victims are at least as common as offensive uses by criminals, with estimates of annual use ranging from about 500,000 to more than 3 million, in the context of about 300,000 violent crimes involving firearms in 2008. This study proves that defensive use of firearms are far more common than criminal uses. This study also only looked at cases where a firearm was discharged, meaning the study didn't look at cases where a gun was simply pulled on a criminal, leading to them running away. This means the true number could be far higher than it would appear. In the town of Kennesaw, Georgia, an unusual law was passed in 1982, which almost entirely mandated that the head of every household own a firearm. The only exemptions from this law were those who could not pay for a gun, criminals, or people who held strong beliefs against firearm ownership. The law was passed to act as a deterrent to crime. Who would break into a house that they knew was almost certainly going to have a gun in it? It was also passed as a political statement, as a town in Illinois had just passed a law completely banning gun ownership. This law greatly reduced crime in the town. In the 7 months after the passing of the law, there were only 5 burglaries, compared to 45 in the same time period the previous year. This almost 90% decrease in burglaries was incredibly greater than the only 10% decrease in burglaries of the entire state of Georgia and the 9% decrease the entire country experienced. In Orlando, Florida in 1967, after a spike in sexual assault, the police department trained 2,500 women in how to use firearms. In Florida and the United States, the rape rate stayed the same, whereas it decreased by 90% in Orlando, alongside the burglary rate also dropping. Guns are not just used for protection against domestic attackers, but can also be used as a deterrent against foreign aggressors. In 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. There was no invasion after the attack for many reasons. One admiral by the name of Isoroku Yamamoto stated that he would never consider invading the US mainland as, quote, "there is a gun behind every blade of grass." This quote is very likely false, as there is little proof for its origin, but it is certainly true that any invasion of the United States would be incredibly costly, as the US has the third largest official army, but the largest unofficial army. Gun control has been tried time and time again over many, many years, and yet every time there is little proof that it decreased gun crime, with it even increasing gun crime sometimes. While the US may have many more gun deaths than any other country, they also have many more defensive uses of firearms, and more defensive uses than offensive uses.